Okay, take it easy on me. I'm new to this kind of thing. I'm Gzowski, and I'm going to try and do a little explainer on microtonal music and tuning and just intonation and what it means, why I do it, and what's interesting about it. So here we go. We're going to start with the basics. What is a note and what makes a pitch? And what makes a pitch is basically something vibrating at the same rate over time and moving the air at that same rate. Your ear picks it up, the cilia in your ear also vibrate at that same rate, and it tells your brain that there's a pitch going on. So if you take a look at a guitar string, would be a good example. A guitar string vibrates like this as one pitch. That gives you your open string. But when you're doing that, it's also vibrating a little bit like all these other little bits at the same time, and it gives you all these overtones, which give the sound the character. It gives your tone a difference between a bright sound and a low sound, or a dull sound, the amount of overtones and partials that are going on here. I'm going to grab a guitar. Hold on a second. Okay, this is a guitar. This is like a Fairy type guitar, but it'll do. So here's an open A string. So it's not A440, it's down a couple octaves, which means it's either A220 or A110 because it's doubles and multiples of that, direct multiples. So if we're taking a look at our fundamental, that'd be vibrating like this, one open string. If I take that string and split it exactly in half with my finger, it gives us what we call a harmonic on guitar, but it's essentially an overtone of this same fundamental. If I divide it in 3 equal steps, or 3 equal parts over here, and I can do the same over here because it's 3 parts, that gives us a note that is now an octave and a fifth away from that, which is interesting, isn't it? If I divide it into 4 parts, there's our 4th one. It gives us another octave, 2 octaves away. And if we get into our 5th, it gives us a major third. Now that keeps going up. You can keep dividing the string. It gets harder and harder to make those notes sound. They get a little bit quieter, but they're there, and they're all part of the sound and part of what makes a guitar sound like a guitar. For instance, even within that guitar, I can make different sounding notes. With this open string, there's a note that has mostly fundamental and not so many overtones, because I'm plucking it right sort of in the middle, and that makes this part of it sound the loudest. If I pick towards the bridge, it sounds brighter because I'm making more of these smaller vibrations happening at the same time. So that gives us more higher overtones and a brighter sound. That happens with all sounds, with all instruments. It's what makes a flute sound different than a clarinet. It's what makes vowels sound different in people. The difference between A, E, I, O, U, it's not just the shape of our mouths, it's the overtones within those pitches, that as we say those, that shape the sound of those notes and identify them in our brain as being vowels. And all those are there within every single note. So if I take a look, I'm going to try and give you an example with overtone singing. I'm not a very good overtone singer, but I'm going to try and do a little bit here. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to focus my mouth to resonate with the overtones, like these harmonics, to make those harmonics speak louder than the fundamental. Or for me, I can only make them about as loud as the fundamental. But you'll hear these higher overtones ring out, and they're all overtones of this same single note. Now the higher ones I can't make it sing out, but definitely I could hear these ones pretty clearly. And those notes, or those overtones, are always present in your voice. And whether you have a dark sounding voice, like I typically do, or a brighter sounding voice, is really mostly which partials are resonating and speaking within your head, in the same way that helps identify vowels. I mean, there's other sounds that help us identify consonants, but we're not going to go there because we're talking about tuning right now. So I'm going to jump over, and I'm going to grab a synthesizer, just because I can do this, and I've got a keyboard under here, and it's going to give us some other ideas. So once you take a look at this, our overtone series, I can play on this tuning because this is the Wendy Carlos Super Just, and it's got overtones. So if I take a look, if I go into here, I play this note. That's our C, low down C, and C in the keyboard. We'll call that our first our fundamental. And then splitting it and doubling the frequency gives us an octave above. Tripling the frequency gives us a fifth up here. 4 times an octave. 5 gives us a major third. And I've got a pedal on the filter so I can make it brighter or darker. So that gets us a 5. 6 is a repeat of the 5th because it's a multiple, 2 times 3 over here. 7th is the 7th overtone, which is a very nice flat 7th, but what makes this really interesting is I add all these notes in and there's no beating. This just sounds like almost like it's one note. It's one, but it's a full chord, and it just sits there and it doesn't beat. Now we can keep going down on that series. We can go to the 7th right there. We can do the 9th. The 10th is the 3rd. We can get up to the 11th. The 11th is a really wacky but cool note. And again, when it's up there, it doesn't beat with these other notes. So you get these really crazy really big sounding sounds that are chord and also sound like one big crazy note at the same time. And that's sort of the beauty of this Justination. So we can transpose those down within an octave and we can get like one really pretty major chord. That's our C, E, G, because we're in the key of C. Now I'm going to switch over and take a look at our Wendy Carlos tuning here. Now one thing to recognize is that these numbers, these are the ratios that we did off our overtone series. So our 1-to-1 for our fundamental. Our octave is 2-to-1. Our overtone, our 5th was 3, and now it's transposed over an octave. So instead of being up here being there, we bring it down an octave. So it's 3/2 instead of 3/1. And our major third is 5/4 instead of being 5/1. That just brings it down within the octave. So that gives us a major chord. And those are all what we call small ratio intervals that are very pure and they don't beat within each other. Now, equal temperament is different from that. Basically, all tuning are really compromises. Even 12-tone equal temperament is a compromise. Now, 12-tone equal temperament, we typically divide our octave in 1200 cents. So an octave is 1200 cents. And in equal temperament, each of these steps would be 100 cents exactly, because it's 12 equal steps within the octave. But as you can see here, none of these are on the hundreds. They're all slightly off. Like our 5th is off by 2 cents. And that's not a lot. So it doesn't, you can hear it when it gets up higher, when sounds beat a little bit. But our major third, our 5-to-4 over here, is 386 cents, which means it's 14 cents flat, which is enough that you can definitely hear. So I'm going to go over to our synthesizer over here and take a look here. So we've got, that's our just third, and it's up an octave just because I find it a little bit easier to hear than down there. So that's nice. And if I go to turn my synthesizer into equal temperament right here, all of a sudden that third to me sounds sharp. And going back to here, let's go back to our Wendy Carlos Super Just. That third is slightly flatter and it doesn't beat and it doesn't sound very coarse. It just sounds really pure. And again, our equal temperament. And if you play those notes one after another, they don't sound very different. That's just a little bit flatter, right? And this is back a little bit sharper. And you hear it when it sits together as the two intervals. That's a coarse third. And that's a just third. So it gives us a major chord that sits with these low interval ratios and gives us a really just chord. Now this also gives us low ratio just fourth chord, which starts from our 4-to-3, our 5-to-3, and our octave 1-to-1, as well as our 3-to-2 And the way you calculate these things, if I'm in G, so if our fundamental becomes 3 to 2, so we want a fifth from that, it would be 3 over 2 times 3 over 2, or 9 over 4, and transposed down in octaves becomes 9 over 8, which gives us our D like that, which is a perfect fifth. Our major third from our G is 5 over 4 is a third, so 5 over 4 times 3 over 2, which becomes 15 over 8, which is up here. And that gives us a really nice just 5 chord. So the Wendy Carlos tuning is interesting because it gives us perfect C, perfect 1, perfect 4, and a perfect 5 chord. And where does that leave us? Weaknesses. Well, that's what gets interesting here. Because normally if we did fifths on a piano, all our fifths would be equal, and we go C, G, D, and our next one would be A. The problem is with our tuning is that our A has been tuned to be a perfect third from F, which makes it flatter than if it was a perfect fifth from D. So instead we have a really nice third, but our D to A is really flat. So our series of fifths just doesn't sound nice, but it's a really nice A. So that just shows us that we would need a different A for a D chord than we would need for an F chord. Now, D chord in this is also messed up because of our F sharp. Because our tuning system has these really, this Wendy Carlos just intonation thing has an 11/8, which is useful for our demonstrations and is a really interesting note by itself, but it doesn't relate very well to any other notes other than C. Just doesn't make nice chords other than our C chord, which has that really big just intonation sound, which makes it useful for my demonstrations, but not very useful for writing music. Now, all just intonations, or not most just intonations, are subsets of 12 notes where you pick which ones you're likely to modulate to, and you have your notes that don't work together. So you would write music that had like, but you would never go, just because that D chord sounds really bad. And the same, an E chord sounds really bad, same as an E flat chord sounds really bad, D chord sounds bad, D flat sounds really bad, but G, that's really nice. Now, you can try to do compromises so some of those aren't as bad, so you can make your A a little bit sharp for your F chord, but closer to your D chord. And that's when you start getting into temperaments, where you do compromises that are not quite pure to give you notes that give you more chances to modulate, because this has really got 1, 4, 5, but nothing else you can modulate to. So, for instance, Werkmeister, the tuning that Bach wrote in, was a really good compromise system that gave you more keys you could modulate into. But that's also why Bach didn't write in all 12 keys, because some of the keys just sounded crappy. And even within each of those keys, you would always have a wolf note, that interval that, you know, you'd have fifths that sound great and fifths that didn't sound very good. There's a nice one, there's a nasty one, there's a nasty one. So you stay away from those, and you try to write for the notes that are really the ones you want, that sound pure and don't beat. Now, we could also do temperaments, like equal step temperaments. There are other equal temperaments that work fairly well. If we go into our microtonal keyboard setting here, this lists a few. 11 is really weird, 13 is really weird, 17 is really weird, 19 is not bad, but everything is a little bit flat, so everything tends to sound a little bit sad or insipid. 24 tone isn't really a just intonation thing. It gives you quarter tones, which are sometimes useful but not harmonically useful. 31 tone gives you a pretty good, there it is, there's our third. Oh, there. It gives you a pretty good major chord, but it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good representation, and because it's an equal temperament, means you can do that chord and modulate all over the place. The problem being, if you take a look at the keyboard below that I'm playing a C, a B flat, and an F sharp or a G flat. And that's just awkward to play, and you have to learn where those notes are. You just can't just can't play what you would think would be a C chord and have it sound like a C chord, which makes it physically very hard to write music for or play on a keyboard. But you can build other keyboards, like the Lumatone by Dylan Horvath's company, which is a generalized isomorphic keyboard that gives you 268 keys, I think, in hexagonal shapes and lets you lay out tunings in a really smart way. And that gives you an option to play these tunings that give you more notes than 12 in the octave. Without them, you're kind of really stuck, either trying to figure out where all those notes lie on the keyboard, or just using a subset of 12 and sticking with it, or trying to tune your tuning system as you change keys. All of that becomes very complicated very quickly. But why do I do it anyways? I'm going back to our just intonation, our Wendy Carlos. I do it because I just find that sound really beautiful. Finding a chord that sounds totally in tune and doesn't beat is a really great thing. It just leads you down all these rabbit holes of trying to figure out how you do it and make music and how do you move around, and good questions, but definitely a big puzzle. Anyways, that's my first introductory lesson, or talk, not really a lesson, but talk about why I'm interested in microtonal music, just intonation, and what it means to me. Hope you enjoy, and maybe I'll do another one in the future. Thank you.